Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third session of the 2019-2020 Learning Exchange Series with the Forest Climate Working Group. I'm Lauren Cooper, and I'll be hosting our session today. I am the lead of the Forest Carbon and Climate program at Michigan State University, and we are so pleased to lead this year's Learning Exchange Series sessions in partnership with the Forest Climate Working Group and various members of the group. If you're unfamiliar, the Forest Climate Working Group is a diverse group of forest interests, including landowners, industry actors, conservationists, academia, and those active with carbon markets. The group has worked together for almost 10 years to advocate for state and federal policies that work to ensure sustainable forest use and prevention of land use change. We have currently been in a process of reinvigorating our focus and activities, and we welcome inquiries into our work. So please reach out if you have any questions or you think your organization may be interested in joining or even just joining our mailing lists. As you can see here, we have the full speaker lineup for the 2019-2020 year. So if you see the past two that are of interest, these are uploaded and available for review on our website, and we welcome you to look ahead and register for any upcoming events as well. So to get to today's speakers, this is the announcement for today's session. We are covering, this is part 2 of our policy series. So in our last session, we had policy number 1, which was at the federal level in the United States. Here we have policy 2, state policy advancing forest carbon in a changing climate. To get to our speakers, I'd like to introduce Steve Long, who's the Director of Government Relations at the Nature Conservancy, John Bartow, Executive Director of the Empire State Forest Products Association, and David Ford, President of LNC Carbon and a Senior Fellow of American Forest Foundation. Today's session will focus on how state-level policies are advancing forest carbon, and we will learn about legislation being advanced or currently in place in Massachusetts, New York, Oregon, and a little update on Washington. But before we start our speakers up, we want to do a little housekeeping here. We're really excited to get started, but to cover a few details, if you are not currently on our email list, if you'd like to get further information or updates on upcoming webinars, please email forestc@msu.edu to join our email list, our email list, yes. Attendees today are qualified for continuing education credits through SAF. So if you are a member of Society of American Foresters, we do share information of registrants, so that should happen for you automatically, but reach out if you have any questions on that. And again, you can reach out to forestc@msu.edu if you have any questions. I mentioned this briefly, but the session is being recorded and will be posted to the website. So, and also with any supplementary material, so PDFs of presentations, any links that are mentioned that are really important in the presentations today. This will be processed and will be up in about a week or so. The session will also be followed by a Q&A. So we do have 3 speakers today. We will save questions until the end. We encourage you to submit questions at any point in the presentations, however. On the Zoom interface, you will see a chat button, which we have highlighted here. It has a little drop-down triangle next to it. Here you can offer up questions at any point during the presentations, and we will compile them for the speakers at the end. If you are calling in by phone, but you have access to email, you can also send questions directly to us at forestc@msu.edu, and we'll be sure to include your questions as well. In the case of outstanding questions, which I imagine will be the case today with 3 very interesting speakers, we will work with the speakers to have these addressed, and we'll compile them in a document that will be uploaded with the recorded presentation. So rest assured, we will get to your questions. Excuse me for a moment. So I wanted to, before we introduce our speakers, I want to highlight important emphasis on state efforts in the United States. We do get a really nice international audience. And so for those of you that don't know, that are from the international community and those that are from the United States, you may not be aware of a growing emphasis and a growing momentum at the state level. We have the United States Climate Alliance, which is active currently in the COP and really pushing the policies forward in the United States when we don't have a lot of momentum at the national level at this time. There's been rapid growth in this climate alliance in the last couple of years. So now it's 25 states. And these states are at different stages of advancing climate policies. But we want to highlight that one of their major initiatives is the natural and working lands. And there's a big emphasis on forest carbon, along with agricultural lands in this effort. There's been regional workshops taking place this fall. New England is currently underway. One of our speakers is calling in from that workshop. So we just want to highlight the topics today in light of this really important work that's happening in the United States. And so with that, we'll start with Steve Long. Steve, when you're ready, can you please share your screen and begin today's presentation?
Sounds good. Great. Can you see my first slide?
Yes, we can, and it's full screen and looks great.
Wonderful. That's great. Thank you, Lauren. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks everyone for being here today. And I appreciate the promotion. I'm actually the Director of Government Relations in Massachusetts. What I want to cover today is a little bit of context about Massachusetts forests, the major climate change law we have, and how that's played out since 2009 when it was enacted, and then also some current trends. And Lauren mentioned the US Climate Alliance. That's one of the big trends that's helping move things along here in Massachusetts. I am now trying to advance my slides without having much luck.
Steve, it was tricky for me as well. There's actually Zoom arrows in the bottom left corner for me that seem to work better than clicking anywhere else.
Okay.
No, those are
now not finding those. My apologies, folks. Here we go. Got it. Sorry about that. Okay, so the Nature Conservancy has 3 key strategies on climate change: reducing emissions from large sources like transportation, electricity generation, and buildings, and also renewable energy development. So that's how we promote reducing emissions, removing carbon pollution from the atmosphere using natural resources, and strengthening resilience using nature-based solutions to help manage climate change impacts. So Massachusetts, we're a very heavily urbanized state, so a lot of folks are surprised to learn that we have 60% forest cover. And you can see the above ground carbon map here of the Northeast, and Massachusetts has a lot of above ground forest cover in the western part of the state. And you get a sense of some of the numbers here of storage and sequestration. And forests really are the major source of storage in Massachusetts. You can see that 67% of terrestrial carbon storage is in our forests. Another thing to think about is ownership. Who owns forests in Massachusetts? There's about around 5% of no-cut reserves among our 3 million acres. We have no national forests, smaller portions of Army Corps and Fish and Wildlife Service federal lands. We have a number of state agencies that own land for different purposes, be it parks, wildlife, water supply, reserves, or timbering, a lot of local parks, and also town forests where forestry is done. But the really notable thing is 80% of our forests are privately owned, either by family forests or families or land trusts. And then one thing to look at as well is forest trends. You can see the graphic here on the left that shows the trends of population and forests in all of New England. And you can see the conversion rates over the past 30 years. And Harvard Forest predicts that there will be about a 20% loss of carbon storage if we continue on a business as usual path over the next 50 years. So the major climate change law relative to reducing emissions in Massachusetts is the Global Warming Solutions Act. There are a number of states that adopted Global Warming Solutions Acts or similar acts around this time, 2008, 2009, and they have statutory goals. These are legal goals the state is required to meet. And you can see those goals, 25% and 80% from 1990 levels, and the 80% goal is by 2050. And this covers all sectors: electricity, buildings and transportation, And there's an advisory committee on which I've served since this group started up. And I chair the land use working group. So how does Massachusetts count natural carbon within the frame of the Global Warming Solutions Act? First, the Act does count biogenic emissions. In other words, what activities are we doing that generate carbon? We don't count biosequestration. So that 80% goal does not include biosequestration. There were challenges trying to find a 1990 baseline. And there were also some issues relative to additionality that made it challenging. So the goal that we have now in Massachusetts is to count biosequestration and weed it into state policy. And there are a number of considerations that we're taking that you can see here, but there are also some cautions too, cautions with offsets that relate to equity and social justice and public health. The considerations we're taking we're thinking about concern additionality. What activities are beyond business as usual? Time and permanence. How long will the forest be conserved? Leakage. Will this really harm other states? Will there be other activities in other states relative to Massachusetts? And geography. Should these projects be in-state or out? So current policies we have on the books related to forest carbon, and I have them in green and red here. Green means that they're active and being implemented, and red means they're on the books but not being implemented. So we have a smart growth program that's voluntary for communities. We have home rule in Massachusetts, and if the state requires communities to do things, there's an unfunded mandate law and the state has to pay for it. So there are a lot of voluntary programs in Massachusetts. And this program here encourages municipalities to adopt bylaws related to conserving natural resources, either zoning that's for natural resources or tree retention and planting. And the two policies that are not being implemented, one is our overall umbrella regulatory act for large-scale projects that calls for no net loss of carbon resources that's never been used. And then the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which relates to reducing emissions from large-scale electric generating power plants. There's an option for offsets for afforestation, which has never been used either. So one program that's been very successful that was launched in 2015 is calling Greening Gateway Cities. This was established in a bond authorization. There was $25 million authorized for this. And really the justification was not forest carbon or biosequestration, but more energy savings for residential property owners. If you plant a tree near somebody's house, they save on energy costs for heating and cooling. This program has helped plant 23,000 trees. There's a very good survival rate of 90%. And because they're in the gateway cities, which are the old mill towns, which are going through economic recovery, there's a big emphasis on workforce development, training workers to do forestry. Governor Baker was elected in 2014. As a moderate Republican, he was really focused on how nature relates to climate change. So that was really the nature-based solutions where we use nature to address climate change impacts, and then the natural climate solutions where we use nature to reduce carbon in the atmosphere. And he promulgated an executive order that really got things going in these two spheres. One thing that followed, and these are all things that are leading to momentum, is the progress report of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And you can see in the text here that it's really starting to call out the need for natural climate solutions, the need for policy to reduce emissions. So sustainable forestry practices, urban tree planting, and nature-based solutions. We do have a statutory definition on the left in the 2018 law that codified that executive order into law. This is the definition that the legislature eventually ended up enacting into law. We have a 2019 definition that we've tweaked, that we prefer. And I'm offering these as guidance, not perfection. So, you know, use these with caution is my word here. Also, Lauren mentioned the Natural Working and Lands Initiative of the U.S. Climate Alliance. The three things that has helped push our state to do is figure out where we have carbon resources, what the best management practices are to enhance those carbon resources and conserve them, and what policies and programs we need to put in place to help foster those best management practices. There are a number of studies and plans underway that are really amping up biosequestration. One is that stakeholder committee that I told you about that I chair. And we came out with a whole series of policy recommendations that were adopted by the full committee. Those policy recommendations are being put into what's called a pathways study. So the study has two phases. One is scenario planning. What's Massachusetts expected to look like in 2050? Population, transportation, economics, all the usual things one looks at when you're doing a plan, and then pathways. So it takes the policies we recommended in our land use group and applies them and overlays them within the scenarios, and really says how they will contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions reductions goals. We're only in the first phase of that, the scenario planning. The pathways comes later. And then the pathways study will be included and inform the Clean Energy and Climate Change Plan. And that outlines what Massachusetts needs to do for the next 10 years, goals, strategies, timelines, and roles and responsibilities to achieve our greenhouse gas reduction goals under the Global Warming Solutions Act, and biosequestration is a part of that. So what are the main strategies that our policy group recommended? One is avoided forest conversion. That's the top strategy for Massachusetts. We want to protect forest blocks. We want to increase land conservation funding, and we want to be sure that existing land conservation programs and funding prioritize carbon stock or sequestration. We also want to streamline and integrate state funding. So if there's funding for a transportation project or a water infrastructure project, we want to be sure that it includes biosequestration. The second strategy is forest management. We want to work with private forest landowners to provide them with incentives or payments or rebates for the folks who manage their land for carbon. We already have an existing program that rewards landowners for sustainable management and managing for wildlife, kind of like EQIP and WIP on the state scale. We also want to promote sustainable and local uses of wood for construction and thermal energy. There's a really interesting building at UMass Amherst. I believe it's 5 or 6 stories tall with wood structure. We also want to make sure that forest carbon is valued. We want to have a no net loss policy for forest carbon. We already have a no net loss policy for conservation land that requires, if conservation land is converted, that a land of equal conservation value is provided to replace it. We want to do the same thing with carbon. We want to create a mitigation fund for large-scale development. And then that policy I mentioned previously that has never been implemented, we want to reduce the acreage of no net loss. Right now it's at 50 acres. We want to bring it down to 10. We're also working on a piece of legislation that would create a program for municipalities. The way Massachusetts works is we provide incentives for municipalities if they adopt best management practices. So we would provide technical assistance and funding for biosequestration projects if communities adopt bylaws related to smart growth, tree planting, and mitigation in the loss of natural carbon. There are a lot of other strategies we recommended, but since today's focus is on forests, I won't go into the blue carbon, urban trees, or soil carbon. So lessons learned over the 10+ years we've been doing this is there's a huge lack of awareness about biosequestration and carbon stocking. So we try to keep it really simple. We have some great infographics that show people the carbon cycle and remind them of what they learned in 5th grade. we realized that most climate policymakers are focused on energy. So they know electricity, buildings, and transportation. They don't know about natural carbon. And we tell them that we will not achieve our emissions reductions goals without it. Private landowners in Massachusetts, that their properties are so small, they really haven't been able to take advantage of carbon markets. So we're really focused more on carbon benefits and not offsets. What value can we provide these landowners that doesn't require the high cost of due diligence? And renewable energy siting has really hit the ground for solar in Massachusetts. There's a lot of land conversion going on. Rather than go toe to toe on carbon, because solar will trump forests in terms of carbon reduction, we focus on the co-benefits of forests: clean water, clean air, habitat, etc. And it's always great to have support from the international level. So we have this great quote from Christiana Figueres that we've provided to justify our actions. It's not just TNC and our conservation partners that are pushing this. There's my contact info. It'll be in the PDF that folks have at the end. So thanks for your time.
Steve, thank you very much. Really interesting. And we have a couple of questions that are rolling in now. And thank you so much for those that are submitting questions. This is a great time to remind everyone that we will hold them until the end, but we do encourage you to submit them as they come up, as they pop into your mind, and we will bring them to the speakers at the end of the session. So again, Steve, thank you. That was really interesting. Thank you. And now we're going to shift to John Bartow. Again, John's the Executive Director at Empire State Forest Products Association in New York. So John, feel free to take it away.
Sure. Do you see my screen up there with my PowerPoint?
Sure do.
Okay. So thank you. Thank you for inviting New York and myself to participate in this conversation. I'm going to cover our recently enacted New York Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and I'll just do a quick, very superficial overview of the forest in New York. New York has 19 million acres of forest. It constitutes 64% of our state's landscape, and it is our largest terrestrial carbon sink. 75% or 15 million acres of our forest are privately owned. Of the 5 million acres are publicly owned, 4 million are in forever wild forest preserve protection, and about 1 million acres in what can be state managed reforestation areas, wildlife management areas, or community forests. Our forest product sector is large at $23 billion of direct and indirect input and over 100,000 jobs, larger than the states of Massachusetts, or I'm sorry, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine combined, but relatively small in terms of New York's overall economic sectors. So, but what I want to do is kind of give you the kind of 40,000-foot overview of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. It's a long term. I'll either refer to it as the CLCPA or the Climate Act. And this presentation really is drawn out of what our State Department of Environmental Conservation, Jared Snyder, and Energy Research and Development Authority, John Williams, are doing at our roundtables. We've had a series of roundtables over the fall across New York, mostly upstate, trying to explain the act and to get input from our forest landowners and wood products manufacturers. And this is what they're presenting as the act. And I think two things I'll say about the act. The first is, even though the act has very strong and targeted aspirational goals, particularly for the electric generation sector, there's as much about what the act doesn't say as what it does say. The second thing is the interpretations that DEC and NYSERDA have been doing over the last 3 months continue to evolve as the way they're reading the act. So I'll try to highlight some of those. But here we go. So New York's CLCPA, or Climate Act, is one of the most aggressive greenhouse gas reduction goals across the economy, with a target of 40% net reduction of greenhouse gases by 2030 and 85% by 2050. That's outside the electric generation targets. The second set of targets are 70% renewable energy by 2030 and 100% zero carbon electricity by 2040. The across the economy targets are really aimed at a pathway to carbon neutrality We have very strong commitments to environmental justice and disadvantaged communities, and there's been a massive delegation of regulatory and policy jurisdiction to our Climate Action Council, which I'll talk about a bit, and to the State Department of Environmental Conservation on regulations. So the targets and what it is by the numbers. Again, a carbon neutral economy mandated at least 85% reductions in emissions below 1990 levels by 2050, 40% by 2040, 100% zero carbon electricity by 2040, which has a embedded target of 70% renewable electricity by 2030 and 30% clean carbon. The Act also sets forth some very ambitious investment in renewable energy cycles. You can see there 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind, 6,000 megawatts of distributed solar, 3,000 megawatts of energy storage, and a significant amount of energy conservation savings. Investing in disadvantaged communities is huge under the Act. The Act specifies that of any new revenue generated, be it from carbon taxes, cap and trade, any other revenue source they generate, no less than 35% of those revenues will benefit on clean energy and energy efficiency programs in disadvantaged communities, which have yet to be defined. There's a environmental justice working group and New York State DEC that will define what these disadvantaged communities are, and it's a big debate right now of how geographically specific they'll be. The Climate Action Council. This is probably our biggest kind of policy development by committee. It is a 22-member council, 14 members of which the governor controls either through 2 appointments that he makes at large or 12 of his agencies, and then 8 legislative appointments that are in there. The Act also establishes 6 advisory panels to be made of stakeholders and experts in transportation, land use and local government, housing and energy efficiency, energy intensive, trade exposed industries, power generation, and agriculture and forestry. We see, with respect to our forest and wood products, the 2 most significant committees being that Agriculture and Forestry Committee and the Energy Intensive Trade Exposed Industries Committee, which will reflect a lot of our wood product manufacturing that goes on. But we do have interest in land use, transportation, and power generation as well. The council is tasked with developing a scoping plan, a draft plan to be developed within 2 years, a final plan within year 3. That plan will include measures to aid in a just transition of workforce, limiting carbon emission leakage, measures to achieve healthy forests, yet to be defined term on healthy, and there's a quantification of the social costs as well as social benefits of the recommendations that come out of it. This is the timeline, extremely ambitious. By the end of 2020, we will have to have a complete inventory and determination of statewide greenhouse gas emission limits. We'll have to have a social economic value of carbon by the end of 2020, a new environmental justice policy by the end of 2020, which actually is in a parallel piece of legislation to the CLCPA. We have to have the greenhouse gas emissions report drafted in 1 year and updated every 2 years after that. The scoping plan needs to be drafted in 2 years, final in 3, and in years 3 and 4, the Department of Environmental Conservation is going to have to implement the regulations necessary to implement the scoping plan. So how does this affect our forests and forest products in the Climate Act? It's really a goal of trying to achieve carbon neutrality. We're going to definitely be focusing on increased sequestration in natural lands. It's the closest we come to a natural solutions to climate change kind of policy in this act. The governor has much higher ambitions, so I think through his control and influence on the Climate Action Council, we'll see a lot more of this come into play. And then also the recommendations that will come out of the advisory panels, particularly agriculture and forestry, will have a huge input on what our forests have. How bioenergy is treated in the CLCPA. The electricity sector was hit pretty hard on bioenergy. For that 70% renewable by 2030, the legislature codified what otherwise had been administratively our renewable energy program and standard in New York, of which biomass along with solar, wind, geothermal was included. In the first 70% of renewable, biomass has been defined out of that definition. So by this act, we don't define biomass or any biofuel as a renewable energy resource. It can, however, in the remaining 30% to reach 100% zero carbon electricity by 2040, potentially be used in reaching that goal if it's deemed to be carbon neutral. With respect to the rest of the energy economy, the act is relatively silent on the role of biofuels and biomass. A bit of attention into transportation and a bit of attention into energy efficient and lower carbon building structures, but really going to rely on those advisory panels to define the role of biomass and biofuels. Some of our greenhouse goals, I think these are extremely ambitious, and New York's greenhouse gas inventory is going to play a role in this, using the 6 Kyoto protocols, the 100-year assessment with a 20-year cycle also being added into it. An interesting thing that DEC just told us 3 weeks ago is that the inventory will omit carbon dioxide from biomass consumption, assuming it is sequestered in net forest growth across the state. That's going to be a very interesting policy, something we're interested in seeing them do, but a number of stakeholders are going to have a lot of question about what does that really mean. The greenhouse goals also put a lot on land use, bioenergy, and carbon capture and storage in going forward. So again, on the electricity sector, bioenergy is not included in the first 70% renewable goal, but may contribute to the zero carbon by 2040 if carbon neutral. The result of the new definition of renewable energy systems in our electric sector is going to throw bioenergy out of the renewable energy credit once it's redefined by 2022. And to the extent that we will need an energy credit to become economically competitive and viable, which we certainly think will be necessary, we're going to have to come up with a new energy credit for biofuels if they want to do that. In other sectors, again, it's silent with respect to thermal use, transportation fuels, and substitution. The new greenhouse gas inventory requirements are yet to be completely figured out. This gets a little wonky and a little outside of my expertise, but we have some very aggressive emissions inventories and greenhouse gas standards that are going to have to be met. And I'll just give you one example. For example, on our natural gas standard, for the first time, New York is going to have to take into consideration the total greenhouse gas emissions from source to emission, meaning, for example, that if we are sourcing natural gas out of the state of Pennsylvania, we're going to have to include in our emissions inventory the methane leakage that occurred at the drill site. Going to have a major impact on a number of energy sources, particularly coming into New York State from outside the state. That's never been done that I'm aware of by any state. I don't believe it's ever been done by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and New York's struggling to figure it out right now. In terms of other markets, lots of opportunity potentially, be it in mass timber, gasification to hydrogen, but technologically challenging in some cases at this time. And then the Act does, and particularly DEC is now talking about the need for net negative CO2 reductions that we're going to have, which is a major role for carbon capture and storage. Again, technologically challenged. We're gonna have to really kind of think this one through. We're also getting a lot of pressure on leaving the forest to grow on its own and not necessarily acknowledging the role that a managed forest and obtained wood products might have there. The Act doesn't preclude it, but it definitely, some stakeholders are very much against it. So we've, at our association, have been trying to figure out how are we going to start evaluating some of these policies, particularly as they get developed amongst the advisory panels. And we've come up with these kind of 5 very broad criteria that we're going to evaluate each policy on. So for example, if you're proposing a carbon tax, if we're going to go to a cap and trade program, if we're going to go to real property tax programs, easement programs, how will we value that and formulate a position around it? And the first being, how do we keep a forest as forest? Everyone tending to agree that a forest is better than a non-forest. The second being, how does this induce private forest landowners, those owners of 15 million acres of forest in New York State, to manage their forests and manage it to their stewardship objectives, which is private forest landowners they have, but at the same time, knowing that a managed forest can be a more beneficial carbon and carbon mitigation forest. How does it help to ensure a sustainable source of fiber and timber supply? Obviously selfish as a trade association for wood products manufacturers, but also the recognition that our wood products can be major substitution products for more intensive carbon developed products, be them steel and other cement products and whatnot, but also the fact that there is long-term storage in those wood products that are deployed. How do we achieve co-benefits to the environment and society in general? Specifically, how do our forests continue to provide aesthetic, wildlife, clean air, clean water, storm resiliency, climate adaptation benefits in a voluntary way? We're very worried about those benefits being regulated to. And then lastly, how do we take this lemon and turn it into lemonade in some respects and try to work at building a more robust bioeconomy to the benefit of New Yorkers and the state as a whole? And going back to the fact that we currently do have a very strong forest-based economy that already is providing carbon benefits. The general estimate is that through our forests and our wood products, we're attaining 15% reductions in greenhouse gases. We think we can double that. And that in turn can also have strong and significant economic benefits to both landowners and the public at large. So that's where I'm at. I'm kind of escaped out of there. So I'll let Ms. Green take it over.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. Certainly some really ambitious targets in there. I know I learned quite a bit from your presentation, so thank you. And thanks again to everyone that's bringing these questions in. We're definitely going to have an interesting discussion at the end here. So now we are going to hear from David Ford, who is going to, I'm actually going to share a slide for this part, who's going to bring us out to the Pacific Northwest. And again, David is a president of LNC Carbon and also a senior fellow at American Forest Foundation. And we're going to hear a lot about Oregon and a quick update from Washington State. So David, feel free to take it away.
Great, thank you very much, and appreciate everyone participating today. I'm going to provide a little bit of context for Oregon and then talk about policies and then specifically some legislation that's in process in Oregon around cap and trade. For context, Oregon is a fairly large state. 63 million acres is our land base in Oregon, and about 48% of that land base, or 30 million acres, is forested. And when people think of the West, they think it's mostly, federal land. They don't think much about private land. And in the case of Oregon, about 20 million acres is feds, and just under 20 million, and about 11 million is private between families, industrial lands, and tribal ownership. Oregon's forests are a carbon sink today, and depending on the estimates that you can find out in the literature, we're basically sequestering about 1/3 to upwards of 60%, depending on the study you read, of the emissions that are occurring in Oregon today. We're not a very big emissions state as compared to our neighbors to the north, Washington, or our neighbors to the south, California. And of that ownership, there's about 4.3 million acres that are owned by families that own less than 5,000 acres, and that represents about 62,000 families, of which many of those families are not engaged in managing their forest sustainably due to a whole range of barriers that we could talk about at some point for those that are interested. And I can provide some information about that in the materials that will follow this seminar. From a history standpoint, we started talking about global warming back in 1990. And the first Oregon Task Force on Global Warming report was developed and delivered to the governor and the legislature that was looking at what are the possible impacts on Oregon from global warming, and included some state recommendations or state agency recommendations and proposed actions. If we fast forward to 97, that was the state legislature passed HB 3283, which was the first, to our knowledge, national legislation that was designed to curb CO2 emissions. It was called the Oregon CO2 Standards Act. And as part of that, in 1997 as well, the Climate Trust was founded to acquire offsets on behalf of new fossil fuel power plants that were being regulated under this new law, which really applied to new energy facilities that were being sited in Oregon. And we moved to 1999 through 2001, and the state Oregon Department of Forestry established a forest resource trust that was designed to make investments in forestation on non-industrial private lands. And in 2001, HB 2200 provided the state forester in Oregon with the authority to enter into agreements with non-federal forest landowners as a means to register, market, and sell forestry offsets on behalf of landowners, and to provide stewardship incentive payments on non-federal forest lands. This is a trust act that hasn't really been used much in Oregon, but it is being looked at again as a potential vehicle. If we fast forward to 2007, the state, under legislation, passed a bill that established the Global Warming Commission, which is still active today, as well as the Climate Change Research Institute. And the Global Warming Commission is really designed to recommend ways to coordinate state and local efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and help prepare for the effects of climate change over time. Lots of things happened between 2007 and 2018, but I'm going to jump ahead to 2018, where some legislation passed 5201, which established a carbon policy office at the state government level to conduct research analysis and stakeholder engagement to inform a statewide policy framework on how to both grow the economy while achieving the greenhouse gas reduction goals that were set in place in 2007. And much like the other states that provided information today, we have some fairly aggressive greenhouse gas emission targets that were set back in 2007, 10% below 1990 levels by 2020, 40% by 2035, and 75% by 2050. And the Global Warming Commission concluded that it's going to be a challenge to meet those mid-year targets of 2035 and 2050 targets based on the trajectory we're currently on. And so one of the things that the Carbon Policy Office was created to generate some information to help inform where are we at with carbon storage and flux, particularly in our forested ecosystem, in harvested wood products, in sawmill energy usage. And so those reports are being developed today. Actually, the Forest Ecosystem Carbon Report which estimates carbon storage and flux, was completed a few months ago. Harvest of Wood Products is in process, as well as the sawmill energy. Well, in 2017, the legislature decided to get more active, and based on the desire to move on climate legislation, and the House and Senate environmental committees held a series of joint meetings on state and regional cap and trade policies and programs around the country, and to try to understand what are some options that they could look at as a legislature. That's led to the introduction of some legislation at the end of 2017. However, that legislation didn't move. In the interim between the 2017 and 2018 legislative sessions, the legislature convened four different work groups that began looking at various ways to address this, and came up with two pieces of legislation that were introduced in 2018. Here in Oregon, we have a part-time legislature that meets once on odd years. They meet for what they call a full session, and on even years they meet for a 35-day session, and that's mandated in the Constitution that they can only meet for 35 days. So they call that the short session, and that short session is really designed to address rebalancing the budget, because we do budgeting on a 2-year cycle. And so in 2018, although there were a couple bills introduced on climate legislation, the Speaker and the Senate President decided that there wasn't enough time in that 35-day frame to actually move legislation. So as a consolation prize, I guess, the Senate President and Speaker set up a joint legislative committee on carbon reduction after the short session in 2018, and began a series of work sessions and hearings that lasted most of 2018. And then the committee was formalized in 2019 for the 2019 legislative session. And a bill was drafted by that joint task force or joint legislative committee, HB 2020. And a series of hearings occurred around that legislation. And the bill was introduced, it's a cap and trade legislation. The bill was introduced at about 65, 70 pages. And through the amendment process morphed to a bill over 100 pages. So it was a rather complex piece of legislation. But the key elements are that it set more ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals. A goal set looking to set a net zero by 2050 was one of the goals, and to create a cap and trade system essentially that regulates businesses that emit more than 25,000 metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions, which represents about 800 companies in Oregon that release about 80% of the total emissions, with a focus in 3 areas: transportation fuels, electric and gas utilities, and the broader industry. And as part of a cap and trade, the idea is they set a cap and then they drive that cap down over time. And if you can't meet that cap, if you're a regulated entity, then you offset your emissions by state allowances that are issued similar to what the California cap and trade program uses. And offsets are also part of that mechanism, and companies could use up to 8% of their allowances through offsets. A couple other quick things about that legislation. It also set up a process to join the Western Climate Initiative, and this would allow trading to use that trading platform that's used by California and Quebec. It also created a climate investment fund with some focus on social justice investments, as well as 20% of those funds would be dedicated for investment in natural and working lands, including forestry. And the final kind of major element of that legislation was that it provided assistance to households, businesses, and workers that were impacted by climate change. That passed the House 36-24, so supermajority. When it got to the Senate towards the end of the session, the Senate Republicans decided they weren't involved enough in the process of developing the legislation, and they actually left the Senate and wouldn't allow the Senate to come to quorum. And so it was, some of you may have read that in the press, where they literally left the state. The only way they would come back is if the Senate president would kill this cap and trade bill, and that would allow other must-pass budget legislation and a few other things to get through the legislature before the end of the session. It was also, there was a grassroots movement that kind of reared up called Timber Unity, and I'll send a link to their website for those that are interested in reading about it. But ultimately, there were many, many rallies around the Capitol, and to the point where at one point they had tens of thousands of people with logging trucks and joining the movement, and it caused a bit of ruckus, let's say, in the small little capital of Salem, Oregon. A couple lessons learned from the whole process, since we didn't get the bill passed, is that, as I think one of the previous speakers indicated, there is a basic lack of awareness about many of these issues in the public and even within the legislature, and specifically around the role of natural climate solutions to help address climate change over time. And I think one of the other lessons we learned in the process was there was a lot of misinformation that was bandied about by legislators as well as others in the general public and in the media. And our lesson was that when we identify this misinformation, it's got to be quickly dealt with, because if it's not, it kind of becomes the basic level of information that people are operating from. And then the other lesson I think we learned was for those of us that were working on this bill, to build broader understanding and support across a range of urban and rural interests. And the rural communities felt like this was really the urban environment of Portland and some of the other metro areas in the Willamette Valley, trying to tell the rural Americans how they ought to live and operate. And so that created a divide that caused a lot of this, the challenges to get this legislation passed. Where are we at now? The governor this fall went out and did a listening tour in parts of rural Oregon to understand what some of the concerns were. Bills are being redrafted both in the House and in the Senate to address some of the concerns that were heard in the rural communities. And there's a strong interest and intent by the governor as well as the Speaker of the House and the Senate President, which are both, all three are Democrats, and they have control of, the Democrats have control of both houses as well as the governorship, and they have a very strong interest in getting a piece of cap and trade legislation passed in Oregon. So it's going to come back in the short session, which begins in February. However, passage is unclear at this point. But I think whether this particular bill or these bills that are being drafted today will pass, or something like them, it's fairly likely that there'll be some cap and trade legislation passed here. If not this in 2020, in a long session in 2021, I think we can expect that. The other wrinkle is that there are some environmental interests that are putting initiatives forward. We have an initiative process where voters can vote on initiatives in the state of Oregon. And so they're using that as leverage to try to get the legislature to move. One final thought around Washington State. Washington State is also engaging in a legislative effort around climate change. There was a ballot initiative in Washington State a year ago that did not pass. And the governor this year did put in some clean energy requirements. But there is an interest, I think, in this coming session in 2020 in Washington State. Different bills are being drafted as we speak. We anticipate that there's going to be some debate and potential passage of legislation in Washington State. So let me stop there and look forward to passing additional information on through Michigan State to you all and to answering some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, David. That was really fascinating, lots of great information. We are going to go into a couple of questions here. We do have Some great questions that have been rolling in. And again, I'll put in a quick reminder that we are not going to be able to get to everyone's questions. We do have, it's always tricky when we have 3 very knowledgeable speakers to get to everything. So I'm going to kick it off with a question here that I think is going to be a little bit different for either side. I think there's some interest in the challenge of incentivizing behaviors and incentivizing forest carbon, of course. And so we're looking, a number of questions are kind of poking around at the difference between markets and a cap and trade kind of solution or market-based solution versus other types of incentives. So for example, one of the questions wanted to clarify for you, Steve, you mentioned benefits yes, but offsets no. And so I kind of want to maybe open a little bit of dialogue between our 3 speakers about this kind of tension between incentivizing certain behaviors, but where does that funding come from? So maybe Steve, if you could start, like this question particularly brings in the idea that offsetting applies the polluter pays principle. It doesn't rely as much on public funds. And so wondering if you could explain your outlook in that regard around in your state in Massachusetts, and then maybe we could roll it into another kind of other question on the other side is why is in the Pacific Northwest, for example, as markets seeming to continue to have traction. So Steve, could you maybe start with responding to that?
Absolutely. So first, the only offset program we have in the region is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And in Massachusetts, that money is focused on energy efficiency and conservation for residents, businesses, and municipalities. RGGI does allow for afforestation, but because offsets, so the money collected by RGGI goes for energy efficiency and conservation. The cap on RGGI has been so low, and the entities that have to pay the pollution credits, the polluters pay through the offset through the allowances, have not had to tap into the offset market. Afforestation is one of the offset options, and the way RGGI's work, that they have not had to. No one has ever had to tap into the offset market, from what I know. And in terms of the incentive that's offered in Massachusetts, we have a program called Chapter 61 that refers to the law. It provides incentives for private landowners for forestry, agriculture, and recreation. The landowner gets reimbursed for a forest management plan done by a certified forester. They have to agree to abide by that plan for 10 years, and they get a tax reduction. They are taxed at a current use rate, not fair market value. So we have a lot of work to do in Massachusetts. And by carbon benefits, one thing we're trying to do is get corporations and large associations interested in sponsoring what we're calling carbon benefits projects, where they would get a qualitative benefit of knowing that they're helping protect a forest for all its values, carbon being one of those values, but it would not enable them to claim emissions reductions on a quantifiable basis. So we're not a model in this area, and we just have a lot of very small private property landowners that make it really difficult to do all of the due diligence required by either voluntary carbon offset markets or ones that are fostered by regulation. So we're in a tough spot.
Yeah, that's really important insight, and that's that seems to be the challenge of scale with the market-based approach. David, could you chime in a little bit and just kind of update us on where that conversation is advancing and what the concerns and opportunities are from different stakeholders' perspectives in Oregon?
Yeah, well, so quickly, TNC and the American Forest Foundation are working on a joint national program called the Family Forest Carbon Program, and I'll put a link in that to our information, which is an incentive-based approach similar to that was just described, really trying to partner with private sector and public sector money to incentivize landowner behavior. And I would say that 2 things. One, incentives can be cash, but also incentives can be providing technical assistance. where often technical assistance is a roadblock, and money can also be a roadblock. And finding private money that can match with public money through programs like NRCS or other federal or state programs can make the system all work much more effectively. So I think we have to be really looking to figure out ways to incentivize private landowners, because most of these small private landowners don't have a pathway into an existing carbon offset program due to cost and complexity. As scale is and costs are barriers. So.
Yeah, thank you so much. And just to John, did you want to chime in on anything on this topic that you're seeing in New York?
Yeah, I just wanted to do two things. First off, it's been our position and belief that the largest market incentive that continues to exist in New York is that which is in the wood product demand marketplace. And we're very worried about the impacts that the legislation, the unintended consequences may have for leakage of wood product manufacturers out there. The agencies and the legislature continue to say, oh no, that wasn't our intent, we don't want to drive them out. But as they see rising energy costs and they potentially see other market influences, such as a cap and trade or something that may increase their cost of doing business, that they would naturally tend to leak. So they're worried about that. The other thing is our offset program in our legislation, I only mentioned it very briefly, was extremely late written and very poorly written. It has a couple of real quirks to it. The first is that they refer to it as an alternative compliance mechanism, and it prohibits any waste to energy project, including incineration, pyrolysis, or biofuels used for energy or transportation, which is a lot. And then the other thing it does is it says that any offset has to be used or deployed within 25 miles of its origination point, which is like impossible in New York to do. I mean, if you did something in the middle of the Adirondacks, there's nothing within 25 miles that you would use to offset it with. And it actually poses what might be a statutory impediment to an eventual cap and trade program, which the Act talks about saying it can be done. But if it's all viewed as an offset and it's got to be used within 25 miles of where it's occurred, it just isn't going to work. So the unintended consequences of all these pieces being in there has created a lot of confusion right now. So we're particularly worried about how that's all going to start to play out. Nobody wants to change anything right away, but I think they'll look at it through this scoping process over the next 2 years and say, oh gosh, we got all this quagmire that's developed.
Yeah, that's really interesting insight. And I recognize that we are over the time. So for those folks that need to hop off, just a quick reminder that we are recording this. I would like to ask one more kind of overarching question, and then we'll follow up with our speakers afterwards for some of these more detailed questions. But I think maybe kind of an overarching challenge, which I think we've all touched on, is there's not a lot of shared knowledge about the opportunities and the challenges in this space. But clearly, states are moving ahead and kind of figuring this out on their own and in ways that make sense for their own states. So one overarching question is for you all: how do you think we can better learn from one another as states, even though we may be looking at quite different landscapes and different challenges? Do you have any ideas on how we might be able to better communicate? And I'm thinking about kind of maybe through the Climate Alliance or some other sort of mechanism. And then a follow-up too was that a question says, David, that you mentioned there's a lot of misinformation about natural climate solutions. So maybe how could this better exchange of information not only improve policymaking, but also improve our communications to the public and to other stakeholders? And anyone can feel free to start.
Well, this is David Ford. I'll start. So a good question. I think how do we learn better from each other? As the U.S. Climate Alliance has these learning labs that are occurring, that's a great venue for states to get together and exchange information. But then there's got to be kind of an ongoing catalog, if you will, of this information. So so there's a place for states that can, basically tap into a resource that says, okay, I want to do offsets, for example. I want to develop offset policy. What are some examples of what's worked or maybe what hasn't worked? And I don't know that that's out there. I've never seen it. And, and I think the Forest and Climate Working Group broadly has some good resources, but I think we really need to do a better job of cataloging what states' actions are and experiences, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. One quick example, if we don't use similar approaches to quantify how much carbon is stored in forests and what those fluxes are over time, we all do it as states individually, we're not going to really have ability to, to compare apples to apples, if you will, across states or across regions. Like in the Pacific Northwest, we are using the same methodology between Oregon, Washington, California. But it'd be nice if at least regional approaches were similar, and that would be a better way to inform what the real fluxes are and carbon sinks and sources are.
This is Steve. If John doesn't mind, I just wanted to add a little bit. I think the U.S. Climate Alliance is a great venue because it has that three-part approach. It helps states assess their carbon resources. It helps them identify the best management practices to conserve and restore and enhance those resources. And then it helps states evaluate which policies would be the best at fostering those best management practices. So that three-step approach is very helpful with the U.S. Climate Alliance. And there are a lot of organizations like American Forests and TNC who are involved, who have staff on the ground who have the knowledge, the conservation science knowledge, but also government relations staff who have the relationships with the policymakers. And the beauty of the U.S. Climate Alliance Learning Lab is it brings both of those parties together, the policymakers and the conservation organizations, to learn from each other and then follow through. And it also fosters a little friendly competition among the governors. They're a very competitive lot. Finally, there are a lot of ways, because of the gap in federal initiative on climate, there are other regional happenings that, RGGI is one. There are folks looking to improve RGGI. And there's also something called the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which involves 12 Northeastern and Mid-Atlantic states that are coming together to reduce emissions from transportation. And I'm not optimistic there will be something about offsets in there, but I think looking at regional configurations of states that want to achieve the goals of Paris and fill the leadership void at the federal level is the way to go.
That's really great.
John, real quick, I'd agree that, somehow, the states make great laboratories for coming up with innovation and ideas here, but at some point, so much of this begs an interstate or a 50-state solution, or we're just going to be fumbling over ourselves in terms of markets, in terms of, it's going to beg interstate commerce clause challenges as we go forward. And just how are we going to, as a country, show some leadership here? It's not going to come out of the federal government anytime soon, but I really hope that the states keep those dialogues going. So, anything from just basic carbon accounting to emissions accounting to ultimately monitoring and what have we really achieved, it just is going to beg a multi-state response at some point.
Yeah, this is really, really insightful. Thank you very much for these answers. It sounds like there's been a lot of great work, but there's a lot of work cut out for us ahead. So I look forward to engaging with you all and continuing to learn from you. David Ford, Steve Long, John Barchow, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your knowledge with us today. To everyone that joined on the webinar, thank you for your time. We appreciate you joining. Again, materials will be available. We wish everyone a happy holiday season, a happy new year, and hopefully we'll see everyone back here January 8th for our Joe Fargione from the Nature Conservancy giving a talk on the opportunity assessments for the natural climate solutions. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Have a great afternoon.